Chapter 1. Beginning of Greed. The young man Jack had always been restless, product of a world that rewarded those who dared to take risks. He had grown up in poverty, always looking for a way out. College wasn't an option, and menial jobs paid too little to satisfy his ambition. His frustration grew until one day he made a choice that would change his life. It started small, breaking into houses late at night, carefully selecting homes where no one would be awake. Jack wore a mask, gloves, and moved like a shadow. He took only what could fit in his pockets: jewelry, small electronics, and cash. He had become good at it, almost professional. The thrill of the crime was addictive, and the money was good. For months, Jack thought he was untouchable. That night, however, everything went wrong. Jack had chosen a neighborhood he thought was safe. A quiet, wealthy suburb where the streets were empty after midnight. He had picked a house at the end of the block, a large home with no signs of security. This time, the owners were awake. The woman had screamed as Jack rummaged through her jewelry box. He had bolted, heart pounding, sprinting down the street to his car. As he sped away, he saw flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. Someone had called the cops. Panic set in. Couldn't get caught now. Chapter 2. The escaped Jack's foot slammed down on the gas pedal as the police cruiser behind him gained speed. His mind raced, calculating his options, but none seemed promising. The sirens were growing louder, the lights flashing brighter. He had no choice but to run. For miles, he weaved through narrow streets and wide highways trying to shake the cops. The city gave way to the countryside, and the roads became empty once more. Police were relentless. His car's gas gauge edged toward empty, and Jack knew he was running out of time. Up ahead, silhouetted against the night sky, was an enormous mansion, hidden behind tall iron gates and surrounded by dense, overgrown trees. Jack had heard about it before, whispers of its grandeur long ago, stories of the reclusive billionaire who had once lived there, the rumors of his mysterious death. Jack didn't care about the stories. He just needed to hide. He swerved the car into the mansion's driveway, tires skidding on the gravel, and leaped out. The mansion loomed before him, its windows dark and empty. He sprinted toward the door, throwing it open without hesitation. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. Outside, the police cruisers came to a stop. The officers didn't move to follow him. He simply waited, watching the mansion from a distance. They knew what it meant to go inside. Chapter 3. Inside the mansion. Inside, Jack was greeted by a silence so profound it felt suffocating. The air was stale, heavy with dust and the smell of decay. A grand foyer stretched out before him, bathed in darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight that filtered through the dirty windows. Massive staircases spiraled upwards on either side of the room, leading to shadowed hallways. Old, cracked portraits of stern-faced people hung on the walls, their eyes seeming to follow his every movement. Jack's heart raced. The adrenaline from the police chase still coursed through his veins. But now, standing in the middle of this decrepit mansion, a new kind of fear began to settle in. He moved cautiously through the foyer, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. The mansion felt abandoned, yet it also seemed to be alive. The walls whispered, though he couldn't make out the words. He pushed open a door at random, stepping into a large sitting room. It was furnished with antique couches and chairs, all draped with dusty white sheets. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals clouded with age. As he moved further into the room, something caught his eye. An old newspaper, yellowed with age, lying on a small table. The headline was barely readable, but Jack could make out the words, "Billionaire vanishes in mysterious circumstances." He read the article with growing unease. The mansion had once belonged to an eccentric billionaire, a man who had cut himself off from the world. According to the paper, after the billionaire moved into the mansion, no one had seen him for years. His disappearance had been the subject of much speculation, but when his body was finally found, it was in a state so gruesome that the details were never released to the public. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He tossed the newspaper aside, trying to shake the sense of dread that had settled over him. Chapter 4. First Room. He needed to find a place to hide. The police were still outside, but they hadn't followed him in. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they knew something he didn't. He opened another door, this one leading to a study. The room was lined with towering bookshelves, filled with dusty old volumes. In the center of the room was a large desk, and behind it, a portrait of the billionaire himself. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes cold and distant, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about him. Jack stepped closer, staring at the portrait. For a moment it seemed as though the man's eyes were moving, following him. He blinked and looked away, telling himself it was just his imagination. But the feeling of being watched remained. On the desk was a pile of letters, each one addressed to the billionaire. Jack flipped through them, his curiosity piqued. Most of the letters were from business partners and acquaintances, but there was one letter that stood out. It was written in a frantic scrawl, the ink smeared as though the writer's hand had been shaking. "You need to leave that house. It's not safe. The things you've been hearing, they're not in your head. They're real. Please, get out before it's too late." The letter wasn't signed. Jack's heart began to race again. What had the billionaire gotten himself into? And more importantly, what had Jack just walked into? Chapter 5, the dining room. Jack left the study, his mind swirling with unease. He wandered through the mansion's twisting hallways, each turn revealing more of the house's decaying grandeur. The wallpaper was peeling, floorboards rotting, but there was something else. A sense of wrongness, like the house was watching him, waiting for something. He came to the dining hall next. The long, ornate tables stretched the length of the room, but every chair had been removed. Instead, mirrors lined the walls, positioned at odd angles. Jack stared at his reflection as he walked through the room, but something about it was off. In one of the mirrors, his reflection wasn't moving in sync with him. It lagged behind, turning its head after he had already turned away. Jack froze, staring at the mirror, and for a moment, he thought he saw another figure standing behind him. He spun around. The room was empty. The mirrors distorted his reflection, bending it in strange, unnatural ways. His face seemed to warp, his features twisting and elongating until he barely recognized himself. He backed away from the mirrors, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He needed to get out of this room. Chapter 6, the bedroom. Jack hurried down the hall, pushing open the next door he came to. It was a bedroom, but like everything else in the mansion, it was old and decaying. The bed was large and grand, with heavy curtains hanging from the canopy, but the sheets were torn and stained. On the bedside table was a gramophone, its needles spinning on a broken record. It wasn't playing any music, just a low, distorted hum that sent shivers down Jack's spine. He walked over to the bed and noticed dark stains on the floor. Blood, long dried and faded. As he stood there, the door to the bedroom creaked shut on its own. Jack spun around, but there was no one there. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried the door, but it was stuck. He banged on it, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Then, slowly, the gramophone began to play. The music was low and scratchy, barely audible, but it was enough to send a wave of terror through Jack's body. He backed away from the bed, his eyes darting around the room. That's when he noticed something written on the wall, faint, but still visible through the peeling wallpaper. He's still here. Chapter 7, Mansion's Secret. Jack finally managed to force the door open and stumbled back into the hallway, his mind reeling. The mansion was playing tricks on him, showing him things that couldn't be real, but the fear gnawing at his chest told him otherwise. He had to keep moving. He knew the police were outside, but the mansion was more dangerous than they could ever be. Room after room, Jack wandered through the house, each one more bizarre and disorienting than the last. The mansion was massive, much larger than it had appeared from the outside, and it seemed to twist and change as he moved through it. Finally, he reached a large staircase that spiraled upward. Something in Jack's gut told him the answer lay at the top, and despite the fear clawing at him, he began to climb. The top of the stairs was a large, imposing door. The air around it was thick with tension, almost suffocating. Jack hesitated for a moment, his hand on the doorknob, but he knew he had to see what was inside. Chapter 8, The Truth Revealed. The door creaked open, revealing a room unlike any other in the mansion. It was pristine, untouched by time or decay. In the center of the room was a large desk, and behind it, a portrait of the billionaire that dwarfed the one Jack had seen earlier. The man's eyes seemed to pierce through him, and as Jack stepped closer, His blood ran cold. The man in the portrait looked exactly like Jack. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The mansion had shown him strange, distorted versions of himself. But this was something else. Jack stumbled forward and saw a diary lying open on the desk. It was filled with frantic scribbles, each page more chaotic than the last. The diary belonged to the billionaire, but as Jack read the entries, he realized they weren't just the ramblings of a madman. The billionaire had been trapped in the mansion, just as Jack now was. The house had twisted his reality, consuming him until there was nothing left. Final entry chilled Jack to his core. The mansion is alive. It knows me. It has become me. Soon, I will no longer exist. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the room around him seemed to shift. The walls closed in, the portrait's eyes growing wider, more malevolent. The mansion wasn't just alive, it was consuming him, just as it had consumed the billionaire. He backed away from the desk, his reflection in the windows warping once again. The face staring back at him wasn't his own anymore. It was the billionaire's. The mansion had claimed him. Epilogue. Another lost soul outside. The police waited at the gates, their cars idling in the dark. They didn't need to go inside. They knew what had happened. Mansion had taken another victim, just as it always did. And soon, it would be ready to claim another. This story is titled, The Mansion's Grasp, A Thief's Fate.